All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Shade Edwards. I am a 2L student at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm going to be your moderator for the evening. I'm speaking to you all from the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples. I first want to start off by thanking everyone for being here this evening. I know that we all have our busy schedules, but we very much appreciate you all coming out. We're here to have an important conversation, a timely conversation. We're going to be unpacking, dissecting, sitting with, engaging with, and interrogating some very heavy topics. So again, thank you so much for coming. The title of our event, as you all know, is The Intersections of Blackness, Queerness, and Activism, a conversation with Desmond Cole and Reakash Walters. This event is being brought to you all by A Coalition for Unity. This is a student group comprised of the University of Ottawa's OUTLaw, the Black Law Student Association at the university as well, and the Common Law Student Society, being the AECLSS. I want to go on further to say a thank you to our sponsors, who are the Law Foundation of Ontario, the Trebek Forum for Dialogue, the AECLSS, the Greenberg Chair, the Human Rights and Research Education Center, as well as the Public Law Center. Additionally, I want to give a thank you to the University of Ottawa Student Union. I want to move also forward and give a special shout out and mention to the professors on campus that have made this event possible. Throughout this process, they have been the wing beneath our wings. They have been helping us since the embryonic stages of all of this, from the summertime to where we are now. That's going to be a thank you to Professor Kyle Kirkup, Professor Vanessa McDonnell, Professor Y.Y. Chen, Professor Natasha Bocht, Professor Frederick Packer, and Professor David Wiseman, as well as Professor Gina McGill. As we all know, our knowledge doesn't exist in a vacuum. We're all learning, we're all engaging, and we're being taught by people throughout our journeys, whether it is in the academics field or it's going to be just socially. So with that, I just want to give a special thank you to my personal mentors on my academic journey, which would be Professor Cheryl Thompson, Professor Carrie Taylor, and Professor Emily Gilbert. Taryn's with us today. She's the VP of the Indigenous Law Student Union, and she's going to be doing our land acknowledgement on behalf of the university. So without further ado, I give a virtual round of applause to Taryn and give her the floor. Thank you.
Ani, hello, Wache. Like Shade had mentioned, my name is Taryn. My spirit name is Golden Eagle Woman, Mizi Gnekwe. I am a second-year law student, and also, like she had mentioned, the vice president of the Indigenous Law Student Association. I'm really honored to be here to participate in this event. I was asked to do the land acknowledgement, and I was very happy and very honored to be able to do so. So thinking about a land acknowledgement and thinking about what I was going to say, because of the teachings that were given to me and it not be scripted, I thought that this would be a perfect opportunity for everybody, wherever you are, to take a second and acknowledge the space that you're occupying today and what Indigenous, or who the Indigenous peoples that live on that land. So if you want to take a second and think about that, and think about the traditional territories and how we are all scattered to be able to participate in this all over Turtle Island. So having said that, I am Anishinaabe Kwe from the beautiful shores of Lake Superior. That is my territory. So I too am a visitor here in Ottawa. I acknowledge that I am situated on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. The Indigenous Law Student Association affirms its relationships, its obligations to the Algonquin peoples, to their territory, and to their traditional hunting grounds. I am fortunate and privileged to be able to learn and gather here today with you. So thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for that. Appreciate that. Did you want me to jump in, or do you have more that you wanted to share, Shade?
I just want to give a bit of a warm welcome and opening for you and Desmond before you go ahead and begin. So today we are privileged to welcome both Desmond Cole and Reakash Walters to share their knowledge on anti-Blackness, anti-queerness, and the intersection between these two forms of violence. We'll be discussing the ways in which the lives of 2S LGBTQ2+ identified persons are affected by and intersect with the law. This conversation will also explore abolition, Activism, and the Redefining of Justice Within Our Borders. So Reakash is a writer. She's a community advocate. She is a University of Ottawa Law alumni. She's a former OUTLaw member. She's a legal articling student, and she was recently spotlighted for being one of 33 Black Canadians making change now by the Chatelaine. Reakash's work has also been featured in publications such as Rabble Canada and the Broadband Institute. Outside of her involvement with Edmonton's BLM chapter, Reakash is also a podcast producer, having co-founded, wrote for, and previously co-hosted Appointed, a Canadian senator bringing margin to the center alongside Senator Kim Pate. Desmond Cole is an activist. He's an award-winning journalist and best-selling author. He was a columnist for the Toronto Star and has written for publications such as Now Magazine, The Torontoist, and Ottawa Citizen. Additionally, Desmond hosts a weekly radio program on News Talk 1010, and this past January, he released his national bestseller, Being the Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power. So I'm so excited to be sharing this space today. Reakash is going to be opening for us. Outside of the great work that they do that speaks to their personality and who they are as individuals, I've gotten the opportunity to meet them on different occasions, and they're really, really good people. So I'm so excited to be learning with them and collectively learning with you all today. So without further ado, I want to open up the floor for Reakash.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sade. And
Too fast? Way too fast?
oh, Sade, mute.
Sorry, I'm here. So I have a video that I'm going to share to open up Reakash's segment. If everyone just bear with me for a second, I'm not the most tech savvy, but.
Actually, I was hoping that we could share it later.
Okay.
Yeah, I can let you know when I'd like for you to share it if that's okay.
Okay, awesome, no problem.
Awesome, cool. So thank you folks for being here. I'm speaking with you today from so-called Toronto on Treaty 13. I honor and appreciate the Indigenous folks who have been resisting state violence on this land since first contact, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and all the other Indigenous folks who were documented and undocumented on this land. I just want to also start by thanking all of you for being here and for honoring all the work and planning that obviously went into making this project a reality. No, I'm not a queer scholar. I've just been queer all my life. And I'm just really honored to share space with you folks, with my good friend Desmond and my former law school colleague Sade. I definitely didn't necessarily think my law school would be asking me to speak 5 months after graduation, but here we are, and I'm glad to be here. So one of my practices is thanking some of the Black women who have loved on their families and communities before me, and showed me how to as well. Like my mother, Judith, my grandmother, Lynette, my Maroon ancestor, Nanny. I also thank my mentors and teachers, Al Jones, Rachel Zellers, Rachel Herzing, Constance Backhouse, Joanne St. Louis, Lisa Cromwell, Heather Hoynes, Rebecca Blakey, Darren Jordan, Senator Pate, Desmond, Billin, so many other people in my life. And the same as all of you, I'm someone who has simply encountered and learned from incredible people as I navigate life. And so, in the words of the Combahee River Collective, we reject pedestals, queendom, and walking 10 paces behind. To be recognized as human, levelly human, is enough. So, as mentioned, I'm a writer, community advocate, law grad, and articling student who's dreaming and building alternatives to policing and punishment. I'm a queer Black woman, a survivor of sexual and physical violence who is really interested in how communities can heal from interpersonal harm without placing already traumatized, impoverished, and marginalized people back in cages. So I have a couple of stories to share with you. And then I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about why I don't think we need police. Now, the first lesbian to be criminalized for sexual assault in Canada was a Black woman in 1955. In her book, Carnal Crimes, Professor Constance Backhouse recounts the story of Willa Mae Moore. Willa Mae was a Black woman and a migrant in her 40s who was living in Yellowknife. She was working as a casual and a typist for the federal government. And then Willa Mae fell in love. She fell in love with a woman that we'll call Laura. She wrote Laura a long letter saying she knew that Laura didn't feel the same about her, but she just wasn't quite willing to let go of her feelings for her. In her letter, she writes, "I would never ask you to try to change. That would be very foolish. Any such thought or desire would have to come from your side. I do ask, though, that you be a bit tolerant of me. If you feel at this point you simply don't want to have anything to do with me whatsoever, you need only say, I'll understand and keep my distance." So after this letter, Laura and Willa Mae spent additional time together. They shared lunch and they played board games, which, by the way, is very gay. And one evening, they were playing board games together when Willa Mae allegedly attempted to kiss Laura. Laura was super uncomfortable with this and reported the alleged attempt to her boss, and her boss reported the incident to the RCMP. Now, the RCMP used the letter that Willa Mae wrote and the signature she left to charge her with unlawful and indecent assault. Now, Willa Mae pleaded not guilty to the charge. During a time in Canadian history when courts often required third-party corroboration of sexual assault allegations, for some reason, the judge in Willa Mae's case didn't seem to need one. Willa Mae was swiftly convicted of assault and sentenced to 3 months of incarceration. Now, although the decision was later reversed on appeal, the damage to Willa Mae's life and her reputation had been done. From my perspective, Willa Mae's story is a clear example of state intervention that creates far more harm than the original action. We know it isn't kind, it isn't respectful to unconsensually attempt to kiss someone that we like. But are there alternative ways of dealing with unwanted advances in community that don't involve criminalization or placing someone in a cage? Are there ways that we can keep one another accountable and learn about consensual sexual interactions without engaging the state? I think so. So during the 1950s, Canadian immigration strictly prohibited any queer people from entering the country. The RCMP would actually go out of their way to hire psychologists to forcefully out and participate in terminating queer workers from government positions. For a long time, Canada was actually explicitly hostile to all LGBTQ2SI migrants and found all the creative ways they could to further isolate and punish queer people. Now, since the Supreme Court's 1993 decision in Canada, Attorney General versus Ward, Canada has accepted sexual orientation and gender identity as a basis for claiming refugee status in Canada. So in this strange shift, Canada has positioned itself now as a refuge for LGBTQ2SI claimants fleeing homophobic violence in their home states. So in some ways, obviously, this is an important step forward. But in their chapter for Marvelous Grounds, Queers of Color, Histories in Toronto, which is a great book, Kusha Dadui asserts that in order to demonstrate their legitimacy, queer refugee claimants are actually forced to tell stories that fit into culturally racist and classist stereotypes of non-white people's versions of gender and sexuality. So claimants actually have to prove that they're queer by participation in events that we know to be largely white, like Pride. And it's actually not good enough, right? It's not good enough for racialized queer people to spend time, say, having their hair braided by their queer Black kin, or hosting a monthly barbecue with other queer folk that they love and care about. Instead, queer refugee claimants are put through intrusive questioning by mostly white, conservative, male, Immigration and Refugee Board members about their sexual histories and involvement in public-facing LGBTQ2SI organizations in their home state, which doesn't actually make sense, right? Like, why would these folks who are fleeing violence be able to prove that they're involved in forward-facing LGBTQ2SI organizations? That's why they're fleeing, right? So if queer racialized refugee claimants are unable to fit within this narrow, rigid, westernized narrative of LGBTQ2SI identity, then they're simply rejected entry to Canada and sentenced to whatever violence awaits them in their home country. So further, although Canada has taken all of these pains to position itself as a safe haven for queer refugees and migrants, LGBTQ2SI people, especially QT BIPOC people, queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, continue to face immense violence from the state. We know that in 2003, Shavrana Abdi, a Black trans woman, died in police custody. In her book, Policing Black Lives, Robin Maynard recounts the last moments of Shavrana's life. One of Shavrana's neighbors called the police because they believed she was acting strangely, acting out towards people in her building. So they called the police because they wanted to be safe. But Shavrana was not safe. So when the police arrived, they dragged Shavrana face down 7 flights of stairs. And by the time they reached the lobby, Shavrana was not breathing and later died in police custody. Shavrana was treated with profound disregard and disrespect, both at the time of her death and, to add insult to this death, posthumously in the media. Rather than mourn the death of this precious, precious Black trans woman, media articles weaponized her gender identity, HIV status, and race against her, blaming her for her own death. You know, I get this is heavy, but I'm sharing these stories to try to illustrate how the police, transit cops, CBSA, and other state-funded institutions collaborate to criminalize, isolate, and other queer, Black, Indigenous, disabled, the precious poor, sex workers, and other people on the margins. And I'm sharing these stories because it's urgent. We're in danger. So while attempting to kiss someone who doesn't want to kiss you back isn't behavior we want to encourage, imprisonment is not a reasonable response to what Willa May did. And while Canada's response to queer identity has shifted in some ways over time, the state still positions itself as the arbiter of acceptable expression of human sexuality, with the authority to decide what brands of gay are permitted within Canadian borders and which others must remain others. So while some members of the LGBTQ2SI community may have felt the presence of police shift over time, which is reasonable, Black, Two-Spirit, Indigenous, trans, and gender nonconforming queer folk are still not safe from police violence and neglect, and that's not okay. And the Toronto police actually reminded us recently how little they value our lives and our safety. When the police neglected to properly investigate Bruce McArthur for years, they showed us how valuable our lives and our concerns are. And that's despite individuals in community raising concerns about missing South Asian and Middle Eastern queer men for years. The police simply did not investigate. So these calls to defund the police, right? They're actually a calling back of community power. We say defund the police because we actually don't believe, because the state has not shown us that it is well placed to decide what community safety looks like. So we know that police have been a force of violence against Black, Indigenous, and other marginalized groups in Canada since the 17th century. And it's enough. I believe that we have to shift our focus and funding and resources away from policing and punishment and towards community-based solutions to harm and violence. Now, one such model of community justice that I am really interested in and try to practice whenever I can is transformative justice. So you might have heard me talking about this more recently. Communities most affected by state violence and surveillance often opt out of calling the police for fear of facing increased violence and turn instead to alternative strategies to de-escalate violence and heal from harm outside of state intervention. Transformative justice is a political framework and an ever-expanding set of strategies that help us to respond to violence, harm, and abuse without, whenever possible, creating more violence. So some folk refer to and imagine TJ as a way of making things right with one another, or getting in right relation to one another, or creating justice together. So we know that transformative justice responses and interventions, first of all, do not rely on the state. So we don't rely on policing, prisons, not necessarily the criminal legal system, the foster care system, etc. We try not to reinforce or perpetuate violence like oppressive norms or vigilantism. And most importantly, transformative justice actively cultivates the things that we know bring safety, whether that's safety in housing, secure housing, free transit, minimum guaranteed income, healing, accountability, resilience. So sometimes folks on the margins don't even necessarily know that they're creating these alternate forms of community accountability and safety. We don't even have the time to reflect on community genius and innovation because honestly, we're too busy surviving. And I think a great example of that are the work that sex workers do with one another. So we know that globally, sex workers are pushed out of circles of respect and are forced to cultivate their own safety. The criminalization of sex work does not actually keep sex workers safe. In fact, criminalization places sex workers in greater danger by making it more challenging for sex workers to protect themselves by doing things like screening clients. So discrimination, deportation, and interpersonal and state abuse, that's what puts sex workers at risk, not the work itself. And organizations like Migrant Sex Workers Project here in Toronto, they actually practice transformative justice in real time by seeking, securing, and demanding safety for all sex workers, regardless of their migration status. In the book Beyond Survival, which is another great book I recommend, Aline Lam explains how sex workers developed measures to protect themselves within community. Now, rather than relying on law enforcement, activists organized with one another, and they organized a phone network where people could report incidents of assault, and they're able to collect and disseminate that key information about abusers in community. And they also share really key information about abusive police officers and how to avoid them. So these folks also trained one another on how to record information about clients, like their height, weight, and shoe size to better identify them. They also taught themselves self-defense. They collected their own evidence. They found ways to minimize losses in times when they're abused or targeted, and even collectively bought equipment to record violent encounters. Now you might say, isn't that surveillance? But one thing that I think is really interesting is these folks used this material, this recorded surveillance material, and didn't share it with police, but instead would share it with one another and take screen caps of the aggressor's face, for example, and make posters and post them around community so that folks in the neighborhood knew who to look out for and who to protect one another from. So the Migrant Sex Worker Project focused not on criminalizing or further victimizing people, but actually cultivating agency and power and resilience so that they can make their work more safe for themselves and for each other. So I'd actually like to play this clip now, if that's all right, Sade. And I think a lot of us have already seen it, but it's a video of Raven Wings, who I'm really inspired by, a queer trans activist, artist, storyteller, writer, and activist space coordinator. And she's speaking to a protest after 3 BLMTO activists were arrested and detained during a peaceful protest. So if you don't mind pulling that up and reminding us of who we are, that'd be great.
I just want to add something. We've tried many different ways to get the attention and the conversation of those in leadership roles and positions. It took us having to do this to get y'all to show up. We've been writing letters. We've been creating books, photography, performance art. We've been doing it in every single way possible to let you know what we deserve, what we need. And you don't even have to dream it up. We've done the work for you. And so it's really ridiculous to me that we're still talking about monuments.
Outrageous, outrageous.
Yes.
It's really ridiculous to me that we have to fight for our dignity. You know, in the United States, there's a saying, life, liberty, and justice. Black people are still on life.
Yes. Yes.
We haven't gotten anything else. Right? And it's in the technology of blackness that we find abolition, and technology of black women, right, that we find radical love and intersectionality. The technology of black trans folks.
Yes. Yes.
In leadership roles to make sure that you question. And this is not easy work. This is not fame work. We're destabilized. We're hyper-surveilled. We're followed. And just like this, we need to create a humanity where everyone and everything is allowed to exist, because we already do.
Yes.
See, white supremacy is creating a society, an ideal of a society, and using the state to enforce it. And this is what we're fighting against. Before y'all became white, you were something else. And we were something else. And we've had to fight in your delusion, your white supremacist delusion, for far too long. You're lucky that this is all we did. You're lucky that we're appealing to your humanity.
Yes.
You're lucky that we're not asking for vengeance
Yes.
Yeah.
or revenge, because that's easy. But our love is radical. It's abolitionist. It's a future where each and everybody has what they need, what they deserve, what they want. It's raising a kid who's 4 years old, who's not afraid of the police. Just to remind you of why we're here.
Thanks, Sade.
No problem.
So yeah, I think we have to be reminded of why we're here. And every time I see that video, it really grounds me and reminds me that we're doing this work because we love each other. It's pretty simple. And before I sign off, I just have a couple of questions that I hope folks can reflect on. Because although this work is, it's systems-based work, it's transformative work, it's also super personal. So I'd like for you to think about these questions. I'm not going to answer them. I'd like you to. How are you divesting from policing and punishment in your home, in your community, with your friends? What tools and skills do you need to feel more comfortable relying on your kin to help you navigate situations of harm, rather than inviting the state into your home, into your community, to adjudicate interpersonal issues? Who do you need to build trust with? And this one's a big one for me. Who are you accountable to when you cause harm? Thanks so much for hearing me out, taking the time, and I look forward to the rest of this conversation.
So thank you so much for your statements, Reakash. And without further ado, I'd like to slide the stage over to Desmond Cole.
Maybe I'll turn my mic on. Thank you, Sade, very much. Thank you so much, Reakash, for that talk. And it's like a real pleasure to be doing this with you this evening. Thank you to OUTLaw. Thank you to the University of Ottawa, to all of the sponsors and the organizing team who have brought this together and made all of this possible. And thanks to all the law students who have decided to come, and all the law professionals who have decided to come and share with us in this learning and in this thinking and in this discussion this evening. It's a real honor to be with you. I wrote out a lot of what I wanted to say tonight because I'm extremely nervous, but I'm going to try and talk as much as I read and refer to my notes, but I do need them this evening just to help me, because there's a whole bunch of things that I want to say before Reakash and I get into this discussion together. So I want to start by saying that one of the most common questions that I receive about my own writing and activism, and when people are talking about our struggles as Black people for liberation, people often want to ask, how do we engage in this fight? Do we engage in this fight inside the system by getting in and by changing things from there? Or do we fight from the outside of the system and try to force it to make changes through organizing and through pressure? And I think that there is a big problem with this inside versus outside question, because the real struggle to me isn't inside versus outside at all. And if we frame the question in this way, we assume that the systems that we are fighting against, the systems of white supremacy, of patriarchy, and of colonialism, that they are a constant, that they have to exist, and that we have to learn how to navigate around them, manage them, learn to deal with them. And I think that this is an important thing for people associated with the law to think about, because the law is presented to us and our legal frameworks are presented to us as being sacrosanct, as if they were beamed down from God, right? Or as if at least they are the best that we can do for now and no one's thought of anything better. So they might not be perfect, but that this is the best that we can do for now. So we don't talk about destroying and dismantling and overthrowing the system. We talk about how to work within or without it. And I would like to say, what if we frame the question differently? What if we said that having to figure out how to live under systems of domination is itself the problem? And, you know, Reakash cited the Combahee River Collective. This way of thinking that says we don't actually have to accept systems of domination and learn how to manage ourselves within them and govern ourselves accordingly so they don't crush us, that actually we have the right to demand something different. That ideology is a radical Black and queer and feminist ideology. And in my time today, I want to talk about the major challenge that this radical Black and queer and feminist ideology is posing for all of us. And that challenge is, are we going to find ways to manage and navigate and survive systems of domination, or are we going to try and dismantle and undermine those systems of domination and build relationships and systems of relating to one another, as Reakash was mentioning, that are based not on dominance and control, but on love, on care, respect, and accountability. So I'm here to talk about Black communities and Black people, but anybody who wants to understand the Black political struggle in this country that you are seeing happen around you right now, you need to understand the different ways that we as Black people are responding to white supremacy, the different ways. We need to deepen the current tokenism, right, that makes Black people leaders or servants within institutions that are killing us. And that includes Canada's criminal justice system and the police, right? We are passing off our ability or our ability as Black people to fit into, gain leadership positions in, get jobs and access to these dominator systems. We're passing that tokenism off as if it's anti-racism, and it's not. Being allowed to participate in the dominant system and in the dominant structures of power is not anti-racism just because you're Black. To deny Black people our politics and our complexities and our disagreements is racist, and we don't want to do that. So let's get into it. When it comes to this internal struggle, I've seen its features in my own work. This working inside versus working outside thing is something that I hear a lot about and people ask a lot about. And I think it's the wrong way of thinking about things, but if we're thinking about it in terms of the systems of structure and power and trying to overthrow those systems or trying to work within them, I think that there are a lot of features of this kind of battle that we see, and I want to give you some of them. Black people, usually Black cis men, introduce themselves as agents of change in this ongoing Black struggle. And their analysis of our struggle as Black people mostly centers itself on lamenting the failures of the Black nuclear family. So we don't have the right type of families as Black people, and that's presumed to be why we're suffering. These Black men often want to talk about the prevalence of gun violence in our communities, particularly among Black male youth. They want to talk about absentee Black fathers. And they also want to talk about the over-policing of particularly Black men. And so these actors then propose interventions that basically do what I was just saying, incorporate us as Black people into the very institutions that are killing us. Let's have more Black police officers. Let's have more Black corrections officers. Let's have more Black politicians and state actors, so that maybe somehow that stops the state from hating us and profiting off our labor and wanting to kill us. Like, I don't really know, but that's the theory. I have to name my own complicity in this as well, though, because you know, working in journalism, all of these kinds of ideas were ideas that I had access to. And when I started writing about my own personal experiences, I think I was given this kind of platform to be like, oh, a Black man is talking about police and anti-violence and oppression. We should listen to this person. And why was that so easy for me when there were so many other people before me who were speaking about police brutality, who were not being heard and not being given that platform? So that's one feature of this struggle, is this very like heteronormative, cis, Black male, like, we need to strengthen the Black family. We need to restore values and honor in our community. And this system is not the problem. We just need to find ways to fit into it. But then we see that there's this Black radical feminist tradition that I'm talking about that is always really skeptical of this appearance of this new Black leadership on the scene that is going to figure out how to way to work with politicians this time, work with the police this time. And those radical feminist Black queer voices are often reminding us that we've seen this all before, that we've been made these promises before, and that our responses to white supremacy, colonialism, state violence, that those responses need to focus on the root of white supremacy and its attendant structures of domination. So Bell Hooks, the Black queer feminist theorist, she refers to this as dominator culture, right? White supremacy, heteronormativity, cisnormativity or cissexism, patriarchy, ableism, that our responses have to actually deal with those systems of dominance. Otherwise, they're not doing anything. So this is, I think, the real political struggle. It's between people who are like, that system is never going to save us, and people who are like, no, 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 we just have to behave ourselves and get better situated inside the system. That's the real struggle. It's not whether you want to work inside the system or outside of it. It's whether you think the system should exist at all or has the right to exert its force and dominance over all of us, or whether there's another way for us as human beings to govern ourselves and relate to one another. What we often see when these two traditions clash with one another is that institutions and Black institutional actors try to co-opt the radical struggle. So they start citing Black women, citing Black queer people, individual people, for the purpose of reinforcing institutional and state legitimacy. They put Black people as a police chief. I'm about to talk about that in a minute. They put Black people at the heads of cultural institutions. And they say that we should cite Black women. But again, they engage in a lot of politics of tokenism, of representation for its own sake, but they erase the politics that informs our real underrepresentation and marginalization. And when that doesn't work, they just attack their political opponents. I address some of these dynamics in my book, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power. And I want to talk about two examples of that. One, the first is the rise of Black Lives Matter Toronto in my city. And I want to compare this to what was going on in policing in our city with a chief who just retired named Mark Saunders, the first Black police chief of Toronto. So in the summer of 2014, our police chief at that time, a man named Bill Blair, you might know him. He's even more horrifically powerful than he was before, but Bill Blair was leaving the Toronto police force after, among other things, overseeing the G20, where over 1,200 people were detained without charges in a makeshift detention center, their rights violated, their possessions taken from them, people were assaulted, people were denied their medication. A tremendous abuse of human rights But Bill Blair was also embattled because a lot of people were beginning to make more noise about carding, this practice of police surveillance that denies particularly Black and Indigenous people our right to exist and walk around freely on this territory. So it's 2014, Bill Blair's leaving, and the Toronto Police Board decides to engage in this tokenism that I am talking to you about, which is not Black politics and which is not emancipatory or radical or in that feminist queer tradition. It's just tokenism. But the police board says, we need a Black police chief. Let's get a Black police chief. And they land on this former homicide investigator named Mark Saunders, and he becomes Toronto's first Black police chief. And at his first press conference on his first day on the job, Mark Saunders is asked about this practice of carding, which just has terrorized Black people in the city of Toronto and documented so many Black people, non-criminal stops, no real investigation, no suspicion, no reasonable grounds to stop anybody, just surveillance for surveillance's sake of Black people, as has been going on for hundreds of years. Read Policing Black Lives by Robin Maynard. And not surprisingly, Mark Saunders on the first day says that he supports carding, but then he also says that he hopes to, quote, minimize the collateral damage, end of quote, that carding has caused. This is the same Mark Saunders who a couple of years later in a CBC interview, he was asked directly, why did the Toronto police kill so many Black people? And he replied, quote, working in homicide for 8.5 years, I stepped over so many young Black boys, I don't even know where to begin. End of quote. What is going on there? Matt Galloway, a Black CBC host, is asking Mark Saunders, a Black police chief, how come the state's police force kills so many of us? And Mark Saunders' reply is, well, what about Black on Black crime, though? What about all of the bodies of Black kids who were shooting each other that I stepped over as a homicide investigator? This is what I'm talking about when I talk about that tokenism and that placement and that idea that somehow we're supposed to believe that Mark Saunders, by saying these things like collateral damage and stepping over young Black boys, that somehow just by being Black, he's serving us as Black people, even though this is his actual political ideology, right? And, you know, while this is going on, and this is an attempt by the state to distract all of the kind of outrage that's going on, particularly among the Black community, about being surveilled all of the time, being arrested, being disproportionately charged, being so disproportionately jailed in this country, all of those things. At the same time that that's going on, we have the rise of an organization, Black Lives Matter Toronto, which forms in late 2014 after Mike Brown, an 18-year-old in Ferguson, Missouri, is murdered by a police officer named Darren Wilson. And there's a decision in that case not to even charge Darren Wilson with any crimes for murdering Mike Brown in the middle of the street in Ferguson. Black Lives Matter Toronto organized a demonstration in solidarity with Mike Brown, but they also wanted to talk about Jermaine Carby, who was a 33-year-old Black man in Brampton, Ontario, who was murdered during a traffic stop, and who was really being, I think, forgotten while people talked about Mike Brown in another country from Canada, which is so classically what we do in this country. And what I write about in my book is that we pretend that we're so concerned about Black people who are safely on the other side of a jurisdiction and a border, but that we don't actually fight for and say the names of and join the struggles with Black people here who are being targeted with state violence. So that's why BLMTO formed, because they started that demonstration and realized there's something that we need to continue doing here with this work. I want to read you from my book, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power, and I just want to read a little bit of a passage where I am talking about my reflections of kind of seeing Black Lives Matter Toronto come together. Black Lives Matter Toronto was different from most Black activism I'd seen. Its organizing crew seemed to consist almost exclusively of Black women and Black queer and trans people whose voices, the organizers regularly emphasized, have consistently been marginalized within Black decision-making and community organizing. The group's members all referred to themselves as co-founders. Many of the young organizers I followed in those early months, including Alexandria Williams, Yusra Kogali, Sandy Hudson, Pascal de Verlis, and Rodney de Verlis, were students at local universities and were actively engaged in struggles on campus for free tuition, the creation or expansion of Black and African studies, and better accessibility standards and services. As I attended every BLMTO event I could, I noticed the organizers often hired American Sign Language interpreters for deaf attendees. BLMTO advocated for Black sex workers, for Black people who didn't speak English, for Black Muslim people. The media rarely explored the depth of experience and advocacy among these Black organizers. Instead, mainstream media coverage focused on the unlikelihood of BLMTO securing the approval of white people with its radical politics and unapologetic approach. So we know that Mark Saunders was working inside the system. And we can see that BLMTO was very clearly, with what they would do, working outside of the system. But is that really the divide, or is it the politics? Of course it's the politics. BLMTO stopped the Pride Parade in 2016, and that was heard around the world. Why did they do that? To call out anti-Blackness within Pride, and to make demands that Pride finally make amends to Black, queer, and trans people who have for decades had been unsuccessfully trying to make this point with petitions, with meetings, with organizings, with all kinds of appeals to Pride Toronto as an organization to say, you're anti-Black, you're not seeing us in your diversity of queerness. And so finally, BLMTO stops the Pride Parade in 2016 and are successful ultimately in forcing Toronto police out of the parade and in getting Pride Toronto to commit to more Black, queer, and trans people on its board, establishing a South Asian stage that was defunded and taken away, paying performers for their labor, right? And getting the police out of marching in uniform every year in Toronto, which was the only thing that anyone paid attention to, but all 9 demands should be known by people, and they're recorded for people who want to know what they are. So that was a huge victory for this radical Black feminist and queer tradition that I'm talking about, but the cost that it came at, the death threats that BLMTO received, the hatred from the general public, the scorn from the media who tell us that they're objective, but just could not handle these Black people who came out and were like, no, we're not going to negotiate with the police. We want them gone. Our media couldn't stand that. And as Reakash mentioned, you know, we applaud queer activists who are fighting abroad and saying, you know, police or military in our country, state forces in our country are still hurting us. But when Black queer people do it here, look at the backlash and the anti-Blackness that they experienced and the cost of stopping that parade, right? It was terrifying. So again, the defining feature is BLMTO saying, we don't want to work with the police or negotiate with them. We don't want to work with oppressive organizations or negotiate with them. Like, we have demands. And we don't need you if you're not here to serve all queer people, including Black, queer, and trans people. Black disabled people, Black poor people, you know, fighting for people to get paid at Pride is a little thing that was like never discussed in the media, but such an important thing for people whose livelihood as Black and other queer artists and trans artists like depends on something like that festival and other cultural celebrations. And it's like, but people aren't getting any compensation. Like that's such a basic like labor thing that's part of this anti-capitalist struggle. But everybody just wanted to talk about the police, and it's much bigger than that. It's a much bigger anti-capitalist and anti-colonial struggle. So you may remember what I said before about co-opting, right? I want to quote Ronaldo Walcott in 2018, because after a couple of years of the police not marching in Pride, they were invited back by Pride Toronto. And Ronaldo Walcott, U of T scholar, wrote about this in 2018, and I want to quote him. Toronto police can apply to march in their uniforms, to march again in their uniforms as an official delegation in the Pride Parade. At a press conference to announce the change in policy during the municipal election last month, Pride Black Executive Director Olivia Nuama, the city's Black police chief, Mark Saunders, and the white mayor, John Tory, were all smiles. But for many Black folks watching the scene unfold, it is difficult not to notice how Black people now represent the face of a decision that is harmful to other Black people and marginalized queer people. They are the face of a decision that refuses to acknowledge that these same communities are more heavily policed than others in their everyday lives, which is what made the original decision to exclude police necessary. End of quote. So just because somebody is Black does not mean that they are fighting to undermine and destroy white supremacist structures and systems, which should be our goal collectively. Just because somebody is Black and queer does not mean that they are trying to undermine capital and colonial systems that hurt queer people. Black Lives Matter Toronto wasn't fighting for mere inclusion. It was fighting to return Pride to its original political roots, a demonstration against police brutality, a demonstration in Stonewall in the 1960s that involved Black queer people like Stormé de la Verrière throwing punches at police who were trying to arrest her, Marsha P. Johnson throwing a brick during the Stonewall uprising. That's what BLMTO was trying to bring Pride back to, not just saying we would like Black faces in high places. And I think that's the critical political struggle here, and I want us to really understand and appreciate that. This political struggle plays out in other places as well. I think about the appearance in 2017 of a group called the Federation of Black Canadians. This was a group that just appeared in the late part of 2017, led by a Black judge in Ontario who was somehow telling us that he was going to be part of this Black advocacy group while being an Ontario judge. Very strange. But the leadership of this group also included Black corrections people, Black police, people directly connected to the Liberal Party who are Black. And from the beginning, a lot of us recognized this very weird group for what it was, which was an institutional response to the radical Black, feminist, and queer activism of groups like BLMTO, who were like successfully getting the public conversation and dominating public narratives around anti-Blackness, around white supremacy in Canada. That work was hitting. And so it's like, but institutional people who are afraid of those approaches and who still want us to work with cops and work with politicians and work with systems that are killing us are like, well, we need an alternative to that kind of radical organizing. And this Federation of Black Canadians was very clearly that thing. And it was designed to take away energy and attention and resources from that radical, queer, Black, feminist organizing. So I started writing about this group because I thought that what I've just said to you all was really obvious, and a lot of other people were saying the same thing at the time. Sandy Hudson, Al Jones, many other people were saying this just looks like a front for the Liberal Party and a way to continue getting Black people to believe in institutions that are hurting us instead of trying to overthrow and recreate institutions that will be good for us. And after I wrote critiquing this organization, a frequently asked questions page appeared on their website. one of the critiques that I had made was that how do you start a Black group in like late 2017 and there's no representation of any of the BLM movement that's happening across Canada, and there's no articulation of a need to support this like Black queer organizing, this Black feminist organizing. Like it just wasn't mentioned in this new Federation of Black Canadians at all. And I commented on that. So they put up a frequently asked questions page after I did. And this was one of their responses to a question about, do they work with Black queer groups? They said, quote, "We acknowledge and partner with people who believe in the promise of Black Canadians. We have absolutely no problem partnering with LGBT organizations and invite them to connect with us via our website, local town hall meetings, or via social media." End of quote. So you created a whole national institution for Black people advocating to the government for changes. And you're like, hey, queer people, if you want to hit us up on social media, we would love to include you if you feel like getting in touch with us. But all that work that you've been doing for our collective liberation in Canada over the last many years, that is like the most visible and talked about activism in Canada right now, we couldn't have been bothered to invite you beforehand. It was really transparent to me. And, you know, my own conflict and some of my comrades' conflicts with this group came to a head during the struggle for a young man named Abdul Abdi, who was about to be deported by the Canadian government. Abdul and his sister Fatuma came here as children with their family members, but they were very quickly separated from their family by Nova Scotia's child welfare system. These two young people were abused in that child welfare system, but the Department of Community Services in Nova Scotia never filed for their citizenship papers as refugees to Canada. And they were the only ones legally able to do so. So Abdul and Fatuma never got their citizenship. And after Abdul became involved in the criminal justice system, which so many people in child welfare do, they tried to deport him. And many of us were trying to rise to the occasion to stop that deportation from happening. It couldn't help but be noticed at the time that we were doing that this National Federation of Black Canadians was not saying anything about Abdul. And it's not because they want to work inside the system and that we want to work outside the system. I'm saying that again. It is because what we were doing was challenging the right of this colonial government to deport somebody in the way that they wanted to deport Abdul, and that we're challenging all deportations, not just his, and saying that people like Abdul should have status upon arrival to Canada. We're fighting for status for all, and our opponents are not. So they wanted to propose, as the Federation of Black Canadians, to go behind closed doors with politicians. That's what they did propose. And to have some kind of private meetings about Abdul instead of all this loud public advocacy that myself and others, Elle Jones, Idil Abdullahi, and Black Lives Matter Toronto, and many others were engaged in. So I woke up one morning and I saw an article in the Toronto Star, an opinion piece from a Black woman named Karen Carter, who was saying, you know, just because you like your activism doesn't mean that you have to criticize other people's. And she talked about how there's lots of different ways of engaging in Black activism. And I want to quote from that piece because she said, "As I watched the formation of the Federation of Black Canadians and one of the Federation's leaders, Justice Donald McLeod, being openly attacked for his approach to social change on social media, seemingly led by Desmond Cole, it disturbed me enough to feel the need to remind us all that no one has the right to determine how Black people in Canada should approach their activism. If one wants to roll into police services meetings or use one's writing skills to critique the systems that have been built largely to reinforce oppression, then that is your right. For those of us who are using our professional networks to try and move the needle to a better world in our respective corners, that too is our right. We should not begrudge the other's approach." End of quote. But of course, I do begrudge approaches that ask Black people to work within systems that are killing us instead of dismantling those systems and creating systems of care. So when I think about our struggle, I think about this idea that all of us as Black people are doing the same thing, that we're all really pushing in the same direction, and that we're not allowed to have politics as Black people because massa is oppressing us and we have to stick together. No, I have politics as a Black person, and I've learned from this Black radical queer feminist tradition that trying to work inside of these systems that were designed to kill us is not actually going to work. So it's a political difference. I want to share one more and then I'm going to stop. Because this very heteropatriarchal right that Black men seem to feel that we have often to just, again, appear and say that it's time to work within the system for a new tomorrow for Black people. There's just every endless opportunity for this to happen. And there's been another one recently with a man by the name of Jamil Javani, who holds the suspicious title of Advocate for Community Opportunities, He's the Advocate for Community Opportunities in Doug Ford's Ontario provincial government. This is a position that's never been created before. Advocate for Community Opportunities. I can't even say it because it sounds so silly. But he was appointed at the end of last year to do that job. And Jamil really hates activists in this Black radical feminist and queer tradition. And he voices that regularly. And he wrote recently in an article in the National Post, and I'm quoting him here, quote, he's talking about Black Lives Matter, and he's quoting from the United States organization, and he says, quote, I disagree with this political organization's support for Marxism and opposition to the nuclear family, including downplaying the importance of fathers on their website, even though the unjust killings of Black men propelled a movement against police brutality. It was actually, 3 Black women that started Black Lives Matter movement in the United States as we understand it today. And, even before that, the movement for Black Lives, Trayvon Martin, Black women, Black queer and trans people have been doing this work. But here's somebody who's saying that actually we have to not exclude men because men being killed by the state, as I mentioned in the beginning, that's the Black struggle. And so give respect on these men out here who are suffering under this white supremacist system. It's an incredibly heteropatriarchal attitude. But do you know what the actual BLM website says? I want to read you this. This is the US website. Quote, we disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable. We foster a queer affirming network. When we gather, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, or rather the belief that all in the world are heterosexual unless she or he or they disclose otherwise. And Kimberly Crenshaw, the incredible Black legal theorist in the US, has talked about this and has talked about something called the Moynihan Report in the 70s, which basically really bigged up this whole narrative that it was like the lack of strong Black men in the household that was really Black people's problem and not systems of colonialism, white supremacy that are like centuries old. So ultimately I cite Crenshaw, I cite Bell Hooks, I give it up to Robin Maynard and Elle Jones and Ronaldo Walcott and others that I cite here because they have really influenced me in this radical Black queer feminist tradition and showed me that the only way for us to really get free as Black people is to dismantle these systems and create systems of care and support and mutual accountability with one another. This philosophy of that kind of a fight informs how we act, whether we're inside the system or outside. Some of you might have heard of Don Wooten, the whistleblower in the United States just now who has talked about the forced sterilization in ICE detention centers. There's a lot of forced sterilization of women who are detained in these ICE immigration detention centers in America. And Dawn Wooten decided to risk her life as a Black woman by speaking out publicly about that. And so I want to say that, like, our access to positions inside of an institution doesn't mean that we have to condone the institution. Dawn Wooten could have decided that working within the institution means going along with knowing that forced sterilizations are happening. And we all do this every day as part of this dominator society. We see evils happening around us and we are complicit with our silence. That's not working within the system to me. That is choosing the side of the oppressor, as Bishop Desmond Tutu has taught us about. So we're not required to play that game for a greater purpose. We're not required to absolve these dominant systems of their violence, and refusing to do so and dreaming and imagining of something beyond these existing institutions is a distinguishing legacy of a Black queer feminist tradition of thinking and activism that I am honored to continue learning from and sharing some of my thinking about with you this evening. So thank you very much. Thank you, Reakash. Thank you, Sade. And I'm looking forward to this conversation.
So awesome. Thank you so much, Desmond, for sharing your thoughts. From here, we're going to have a bit of a conversation. I'm going to pose to you guys some general questions that we had curated. And then from there, we're going to switch over to audience questions that were given during registration. So I want to open by asking you both the following. Why do you recommend turning towards abolition opposed to reform? And how do we practically and realistically and in real time get there?
I mean, Desmond, do you want to go ahead? I feel like you were just...
No, I've been talking for a bit. Let me take a break. You go.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is a kind of stream that's connecting both some of the thoughts that I had and some of the thoughts that Desmond had, that what we have built, what they have built, isn't working for us. It's not allowing us space to be safe or liberated or taken care of. It doesn't allow us even the time to look after one another, right? So I think that's why we know that this isn't working, and that's why we know we have to do something different, is because when I look around me and when I see Black folks outside, when I see Black folks in my community, when I see my family, when I see my friends, it's like there has to be a reason why so many of us are struggling. It's not us, right? Because I know that we're filled with intellect, magic, hard work, love, care, strategy, you know what I mean? And so if we continue to struggle, then that means that there's something actually going on that is exerting so much pressure and stress on us that we don't have the opportunity to be free. Like what Raven shared with in that video that we were looking at, there's a block there that I think we have to take responsibility for looking out for one another and like actually pointing to the thing that's wrong, instead of acting as if it's, these nebulous systems that I just can't put my finger on. It's like, no, I know what it is. It's capitalism. Like, I know what it is. It's racism. I know what it is. It's homophobia. It's transphobia. Like, it's what you're doing to me. You're doing it right now, and I have to point it out so that you can stop.
Yeah, I very much think that the steps that we need to take are always in progress already, and that we should think of it as like, how do we further that ongoing process rather than like having to start something that's not being done. So as Reakash was talking about, like, people are already being like, how do we create support networks within our community so that we never call the police? And I do want to say that when it comes to things like domestic violence, some people don't have the option to feel safe and to not call the police because they don't have an alternative set of supports or options, even if they would like to not call. And so people are developing those within community. And I think the sex work example that Reakash gave is like a very, very good one. I know of one in my own neighborhood here too, where people have just formed a collective essentially. And so there were a whole bunch of people who got angry at a store owner in my community because the store owner put some like pro, Black life kind of signage up in front of their store, and they started getting death threats and they started getting all this stuff. And because Black people are involved in that store and are being threatened, people are like, well, calling the police here to say, hey, white people are threatening us over our sign because they don't like anti-racism. Calling the police to that situation is not really a desirable option for those folks. So they actually had community people to come down to that store when people were coming there to harass them and to surveil them and to intimidate them. And it's just one example, but that work is already happening. People are already developing alternatives of response to police for people in mental health crisis. So I don't believe, for example, that we can't abolish the police until we have a perfect replacement for them. The police are not just like flawed in some sense, like they're designed to hurt some of us to satisfy and pacify and make comfortable other people. The police are designed to hurt some of us. So I don't need a perfect replacement for a system that's designed to hurt me. Like we need something else now, even if we don't have all of those answers, Sade, but like people are doing the work today in our communities. And I think we have to read and we have to talk to each other and we have to really start from a position of like, what do we want? When we feel scared, what kind of a response do we want? When we don't have enough to eat, what kind of response do we need? What can we provide rather than waiting for this system, which is always finding a new way to ignore us or to push us back?
I also, just building on that, Desmond, I want to question this idea that it has to be like the police or some other alternative that we're just going to like drag and drop and plop and like that's going to be the new thing. I think we have to take it step by step, because if you think about issues that, for example, the police respond to, it's like that. Do we need someone to show up with a gun or some other weapon to do that work? Like if my neighbors are being too loud, okay, do I need to call someone with a gun to show up and knock on my neighbor's door and be just like, hey, can you turn on the music? No. Maybe I should have a good relationship with my neighbors so that if they're being too loud, I can go over there and say, hey, you're being too loud. And like, these are the consequences that we've come up with in community for if you just continue to disrespect me and the fact that I have to work in the morning, right? Or like if somebody, their plates are not registered or something like that, right? Or their headlights are out. Do we need a police officer? Like there's so many Black people who have died because their headlights were out or because they took a turn that was too wide, right? So do we need someone to show up with a gun and be like, hey, your headlights are out? No. Like we could really just have the city extend their services, and when someone's headlights are out, say, hey, I have a new headlight for you. I'll just change it right here. Like there's so many different ways of dealing with so many of the things that the police do that when you really think about it, it's like, I don't actually need you to do that.
Nice. Thank you so much on building there. And I want to kind of piggyback on what you said as far as it relates to community. What responsibility do you guys think turning towards community-based solutions to harm and violence places upon those of us within society? And how can we go about cultivating communities of care?
So I think one of the biggest responsibilities that new ways of relating to each other puts on us is that we have to take responsibility for the violence that does exist in our communities, that is inter-community, interpersonal violence within our families, violence within our peer groups. Of course, we want to abolish the violence of state and of policing, but that doesn't get rid of patriarchy. That doesn't get rid of the rampant gendered violence that is cultural and that we need to address, right? So I think the hardest thing is that certainly I don't want to call the police, but if I know that somebody close to me is abusing their partner and I don't want to call the police, what's my responsibility in that scenario? If I'm not going to call somebody else to go there and deal with it, what am I doing? How am I getting other people together in my community to say, this is actually our problem and we have to do something? That's like the really big thing that I think as men, we're not ready for. We're not ready to take accountability for violence that is of our own causing and of our own cultural programming. And that's all men, because patriarchy and these systems of power like confer certain benefits onto people in our fake gender binary, right? And we have to accept that, and we have to take responsibility to say that when I know that I'm causing harm, or when I know that somebody else around me is causing harm, it's my problem. And there isn't going to be an outside service that just pick up the phone and I dial and say, yeah, somebody over there sounds like they're into something. Please go and deal with it, right? And basically outsourcing the responsibility to address violence in our communities. That's what we're doing. We're outsourcing it. We're not actually addressing it. And I think like that is such a hard way to start thinking because it's so outside of what we do now. But how else are we going to end gendered violence if we don't start taking accountability in our own communities?
Right. Because I think, again, if we kind of broke it down into its pieces, right? We're in a conflict with somebody else, and then we call a stranger to help us with the conflict with our loved one, right? And I don't think that makes sense. Like, I think when you think about it, it actually doesn't make sense. And one of the tools that I have been talking about a lot and working on within my own circles, my own immediate circles, and with other organizations that I care about, it's called pods and pod mapping. And I think a lot of us have heard of it. It's sort of coined and developed by the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. And basically there's, the sheet, and there's the circle in the middle for who you are, and then circles around you, right? And so you identify who is in your circle, who's in your pod. And similar to sort of the questions I was also asking in my part of the talk, you figure out, okay, if I'm in danger, who do I want to call? Who's going to make me feel safe? So that means that not only do I have to think of those people, I actually have to call them. I have to call Desmond and be like, hey, by the way, if something goes wrong, I'm going to call you. And also, this is who my partner is. These are who my friends are. This is who my neighbor is. This is who I see walking down the street every day, right? So like he knows what's going on. So if something happens, I can call him and he's like, oh, I'm going to come here because we have a plan, right? It's like safety planning. And so we have to have those conversations, but we also have to have the conversations. And maybe it's not Desmond. Maybe I'm not comfortable calling Desmond when I screw up, right? Maybe I want to call my mom. And I call my mom and I'm like, Mom, I made a mistake. I caused someone harm. I put someone in danger. It was really messed up. Like, can we talk about it? Can you help me move through the steps I need to take to make this right? And I think that when we not only take responsibility for other people, but we also take responsibility for our own harm and break down this hard binary between the person who's causing harm and the person who's harmed, between abuser and abused, because we can always be either one or both. And so if we can just sit with that and know that that's true, that I think that there's a lot of work that we can do and forgiveness that we can have for each other, and then space to admit when you're actually the one causing harm.
Can I also just add to that too, that I think one of the most destructive things about capitalism and this white supremacist nightmare that we are all living in is that it actually tells us that people will not hold themselves accountable unless they're forced to. And that is the logic behind the carceral system. That is the logic behind the police. That is the logic behind the child welfare system that took Abdul and Fatuma away. It tells people that if we don't force you to be good, you just won't do it. So we have to force you. And like our whole society is designed on this. And somebody listening to this talk right now is like, yeah, right, mutual systems of accountability. But if we cannot imagine in this tradition that I'm talking about tonight, like if we're not allowed to imagine something different, what are we doing here? except living as enslaved people still under these systems. So we have to be able to imagine that people will hold themselves accountable. Otherwise, welcome, right? Welcome to the show.
And also, I mean, I'm in my own life seeing that happen in real time. I've seen it happen in, you know, my family even, that someone, no, they're not willing to take accountability. And so we have to make space. Like there has to be space made between the person who's causing harm and the person who's being harmed, because it's just like not safe, right? And so we have to accept that sometimes that's what it needs to look like. That person doesn't need to be tortured day in and in, day out. They don't need to be placed in a cage, right? But yeah, no, they don't have to live in my house with me, okay? But at the same time, you know, there's someone in my life who has caused harm, right? And the conversation I had to have with him and continue to have with him is, that's not cool. Like, you shouldn't have done that. And I don't like it. It doesn't make me feel good. And so, you know, what do you want to do about it? And this person wants to figure out how to make things right and is genuinely invested in doing the right thing. And so I think, like Desmond says, we have to believe in one another. And Adrienne Marie Brown talks about this as like a sort of Black futurism, is like imagining this future where we look out for each other and we take care of each other. And that has to be at the center of why we do the work. Or again, like Desmond said, what's the point? Like, why are we here?
Thank you guys so much for sharing your thoughts and those questions. Just with respect to time, I want to kind of dive into the audience questions. So I'm going to present the first one to you both. So it says, as a trans person of color, I often feel severed from significant parts of myself as I enter spaces of my communities of origin. And in trans queer communities, enormous parts of myself are absent in those predominantly white spaces. These experiences are often isolating rather than nourishing, and may do more harm to my sense of belonging, and I will often refrain from engaging in anti-racist work and trans queer spaces to avoid the feeling of separateness. How have you engaged in anti-Black racism work with communities that may be anti-queer? And how have you engaged in trans queer spaces which may be white dominated?
It's a great question. I think, do you want to go to it?
Go ahead.
I think that's hard. I think that's a huge question that like all three of us have encountered. And Sade, I'd love your thoughts on this too. But even yesterday, Des and I were on the phone, and I just said honestly to him, like, sometimes I get nervous when I'm around uncles. It's a fact. I'm not going to pretend that I feel my fullest, queerest self around elders in my community. But I think that sometimes we have to give folks the opportunity to go through those moments of like maybe saying the wrong thing and giving folks the opportunity to grow. Because I've seen that in my circles, especially with older Black folks in my community, older Jamaican people in my community, that maybe the first time I bring it up, there's a bit of a jolt, right? And the first time I identify myself and I'm, you know, real with who I am, there's that challenge, there's that hump. But a lot of folks come around, and you know, this is a bit personal, but when I came out, my grandma was the first one to call me, and she was like, "Hey, Beverly, I love you. Like, I hope you're doing good. I hope you're taken care of." And I don't think I would have expected that from my 86-year-old grandmother. But I think sometimes we have to give folks the opportunity to do that work. And then I think in queer communities, that's also definitely a challenge. But we're out here is the thing, right? Like, there's queer Black folk, queer POC folk, queer Indigenous folk who are out in these streets being honest about who they are. Depending on your city, I think it's going to be more or less challenging. But for myself, when I was in Edmonton, I, you know, just tried to identify the folks who were living a similar set of circumstances as me, tried to identify the other queer Black folk. And to be honest, there's that initial obstacle of distrust, right? Because I think we're used to not being accepted by one another sometimes in certain spaces. And so we circled around each other for a little bit. We kind of tiptoed. And after we built a bit of trust, those bonds are the ones that are just completely unbreakable for me, like will never be broken, and that I cherish so much. And so, yeah, whoever wrote that question and other folks who are moving through that experience, I just want to send courage your way and intentionality your way and patience your way, because it's hard. It's definitely hard work, but I think we got to take those chances and take those leaps and be brave.
Mhm. I mean, I guess I would add to that I don't really know of any spaces that are free from all of these kinds of norms and of discriminations. And, you know, Reakash, you were mentioning earlier that sometimes we are experiencing harm and sometimes we're the ones dishing it out. And, you know, I definitely agree with that. And I think a lot about sometimes harms that I have caused, not thinking about how I'm particularly moving in spaces and whether or not I'm making space for other people, whether or not I'm allowing for other people's voices to be amplified, given some of the opportunities that I get given. And there are just no like fully safe spaces for us to do this work or to talk about it. And the only thing that has helped me to survive is like having some very close people in my life that I can talk to about how that feels and who I can confide in about like struggles that I'm personally having. But I also think it's like important for me to listen because there are a lot of other Black queer people in our communities who are going through a lot more challenging circumstances than I am. And, you know, I want to share love and I want to share understanding and taking out all of the thinking and all of the learnings in my mind that have led me to be at times harmful, pushing people out, not listening to people. So I'm so grateful for the people I can talk to. I'm very grateful for people like, you know, my friend Idil Abdullahi, who I was like able to talk to before this chat today and be like, I'm really nervous because of this and this and this and this. And we've all had experiences of not feeling welcomed in spaces and not feeling like we can be ourselves in spaces and in our own families, definitely. And I am just grateful for the few people in my life who I can always confide in. And I hope for you who asked that question that you do have people. And I think like when our moving together is small and it's not these big grand organizing, it's still legitimate and it's still valid, that you don't have to organize with a big collective of people if that doesn't feel like a good or productive or safe thing for you to do. And that some of the most liberatory, and I'm being serious about this, some of the most liberatory work that I have done has been with one or two other people. Even if that's just like helping somebody get housed. I'm dead ass. Like, I'm not talking about out here political work that public people see. I'm just talking about little victories of humanity because me and some other folks got together and did something real. So, you know, yeah, that's what I would say.
And also just naming that neither of us is trans, right? Or both cis. And so I've only moved through the world as a cis queer woman, and I can only offer my perspective from that, and just kind of also just naming the limitations of this conversation. As much as we might share some lived experiences, there's going to be other areas that it's, you know, I don't face the same challenges.
So thank you so much. So I kind of want to shift gears a bit in terms of the theme of the questions. This questions are more revolving around activism. So what would be your advice during this pandemic on how best to utilize the time that we do spend on social media and technologies to do good activism and advocacy, work that is sustainable and also meaningful?
Mm-hmm.
Not to be a grandma, but I low-key think some of us need to get off of social media and just read books and just like be in conversation with each other, but also just read books, please. So Audiobooks too.
I have to agree. I actually don't think that the pandemic necessitates that we just migrate our activism online. Here we are talking in a university forum where classes have simply been migrated onto online forums, in many cases without any real regard for what that means for people, what it means in terms of people's accessibility needs, and what it means in all kinds of ways, paying the same amount of tuition for online courses versus in person. Like, like, can we really just transfer our activism online because they told us to stay inside? We were talking before about violence within civilian communities that is not like police initiated violence, right? And I think one of the reasons that is so prevalent is that housing is not a right, food is not a right, childcare is not a right. And so people actually can't just go to a safe place when they want to go to a safe place. And they are stuck in situations that are unsafe because they don't have another option. This housing crisis that I'm seeing and we're all seeing here in Toronto, that's been in existence for decades, means that I have put on a mask and gloves during a pandemic, and I have gone down to a homeless encampment in central Toronto where the police were coming to move homeless people, i.e. destroy all of their belongings, throw them in the garbage, and arrest anybody who wanted to resist. Because you're not allowed to evict somebody during a pandemic, but apparently that doesn't apply to people living outside in a park. So I wasn't going to be tweeting about the fact that the police and the city workers were coming to dismantle an encampment that day. I had to physically go down there and risk my own safety so that other people could have a little bit of a sense of safety for a little bit longer in the place where they were trying to stay. That's the real, like, we are out here. We were out here in the tens of thousands after Regis Korchinski-Paquette died. And let me tell you something. If they hadn't gotten outside and burned down that police station in Minneapolis, we would be having a different conversation today. But Black people have decided that that's actually, again, like, it's that refusal that I, again, think is like such a queer thing, is that like, we're not taking the options that you're giving to us. We're making a whole new set of options. That includes having to defy these orders to stay inside and be quiet when the state is killing us and displacing us.
And I agree. I think on this kind of thread of housing and how that's something that has really come to the forefront in this pandemic, because, we're all told to stay home, but what happens if you don't have a home, right? I just want to alert people to the camp. There's a prayer camp against police violence in Edmonton. And for those who can donate, Black Lives Matter Edmonton is taking donations, monetary donations, but also usually on Instagram. They're posting needs that they have. On Twitter, people are posting needs that they have on a weekly and daily basis. And every day they're resisting houselessness and homelessness in so-called Edmonton. I also just want to speak to sort of what Desmond is saying in terms of, like, yes, in certain ways we have to be careful in the ways that we resist, but sometimes we actually just need to do what we got to do, right? Like a few months ago, there were some families who were being evicted from Habitat for Humanity, and myself and some other folks who were involved organizing for Black Lives in Edmonton were like, no, we just can't let this happen. And so we set up camp outside of one of the outposts for Habitat for Humanity, and we found creative ways to resist online, but we also found ways to resist in person, because that's like what we had to do to disrupt the violence that was happening in folks' lives. And again, as Desmond mentioned, that's what we saw when there was protests across the world in the name of Black violence, specifically in this case for the death of George Floyd. And so I think that these conversations are challenging because obviously we want to be safe, but sometimes we actually just have to be on the streets when we need to be.
So thank you. I'm going to follow up with another question. So how can white allies engage in anti-racist work without adopting a white savior complex?
My favorite and least favorite question. Okay. Maybe you can't. Point one. Possible, very possible that you actually cannot. I
Stay
assume it's,
open.
was that?
Stay open to that possibility.
I think you should stay open to the possibility that you can't actually do that. And that's what I think in reference to the previous question, right? About like spaces that are oppressive. Like, has anybody ever organized in a space that wasn't? I would really love to hear your experience because I don't know that such a space really does exist. But I really just want white allies to stop asking questions about white allyship and go read some stuff. Like, I don't know what to tell y'all. I get this question. That's why I'm laughing, because I get this question every single time I've done a talk in 2020. How do white people be better allies? How do white, apparently by asking that question over and over again is how you be. And if I tell you, will you listen? Right? So if I say, give up all your possessions and follow me, a la JC, you know, will you listen to me? You know, you kind of you kind of have to make your own way in this struggle the exact same way that we do. But I cannot make a white people handbook for how to not harm us. I just, there's so much reading out there. How do you think that we are reflecting on the things that we are reflecting on, if not by reading and by listening? I think the impetus for the question is understandable because it says we want to support, but we also recognize as white people that we can do so in incredibly harmful ways. That's true. But it's just a lot to be put on the spot as a Black person every time and try to like distill it down into a nice 90-second answer for you. I can't do it. I can't do it, but I could tell you 500 books that you should go read, some of which I have not yet read, that would probably help you. And maybe just stop asking that question because we get it every single time. And I don't know that white people are really great at just like, you know, hearing us say like, it's out there for you, but I'm going to say it again. It's out there for you. And you have to engage in a practice. I cannot just tell you and then everything is good and then you go and do something tomorrow and everything ends up perfect. You actually have to engage in this day to day. You have to make mistakes. You have to fuck up. And sometimes you've got to do the thing that you're hoping that you won't do. But I mean, if your worst fear is that you're going to make a mistake in engaging in an open and like good faith way, don't be scared of that, because the only then option other than that is inaction or cynicism. So if your worst fear is that you can't do this perfectly without harming, there are other things to worry about.
Yeah, I would say like, just on that same thread, that I think a lot of folks are really conflict averse. And so I think this question comes up because they want to know how to do the right thing all the time. But that's not a thing. And it's actually like, I'm really impatient with that idea. It's like sometimes you'll do your best and then you'll make a mistake and someone will be like, hey, what the heck? That sucks. And then you have to just sit with that and then figure out how to move forward. And that's actually 100% fine. But I would say like a short list, if I were to offer a short list in this moment, it would be like, figure out how not to call the cops, figure out how to make all your aunties stop calling the cops. And I feel like every day there's resources for organizations to donate to. Like, redistributing resources is also, I think, a really big thing that a lot of folks can do. And one thing that really, I don't know, I think just today I realized it bothers me is that sometimes folks pretend that they're like working class or something, so that you feel like you can be closer to Black people. I don't know, it's very strange. And then I found out you actually have this bougie cabin in the woods that you like just go to with your partner or your mom and dad. And like, to me, that's completely ridiculous. Like, if you have a space, and if there's organizations that need spaces to like hold events or just retreat to or just chill, like if you just have money coming out of your orifices, and then there's people out here struggling to make ends meet and in their, you know, immediate circles, but then also just struggling to get the projects that they want to do off the ground, like that's so perverse. So I would say figure out, like, take stock of all of the resources and access and things that you have to offer, and then just offer them.
And with that, I'm going to follow up with the next question. It's probably going to be our last question given the time, and I want to give you guys both a chance to make any closing remarks if you so wish. So how do we as a community ensure the safety of activists in events such as demonstrations, protests, and rallies? So we've seen instances in America more so where activists have disappeared. So what advice do you guys have on how we can keep each other safe in these spaces?
Well, I think our biggest challenge is numbers. I want to back up first and say that sometimes we conceive of the beginning and end of radical organizing as the street protest, and it is not. So I just want to say for people that that's not your jam, that you maybe have reasons why you can't actually even participate in those kinds of demonstrations because they are triggering, because you have been harmed before while doing that kind of work because of a disability issue and these kinds of events not being accessible. Like, there are all kinds of reasons why people can't or don't want to participate in the street fanfare, and you don't have to, because that's not the revolution. That's not the only part of it anyway. You know, Sade, it's very true. We see people getting snatched up in vans in the United States, but I'm sitting here watching as people in 6 nations right down the highway here from me are being criminalized near Caledonia. The people of the Grand River 6 Nation being pushed aside so that a development company can basically extend the borders of Caledonia and just push Indigenous people further off of a territory that they're laying a claim to. In this case, Haudenosaunee people. We should be putting our bodies on the line so that it doesn't end up being a situation that people are basically outnumbered all the time by civilian or by police forces and by paramilitary forces. You know, we're not going to win the kind of struggles that put us against an armed police force. That's not the fight that I want, actually, right? But it's easier when there's 1,000 of us than when there are 10. And so when we did the scholar strike at the beginning of the university school year, you know, I talked about this struggle for what's called 1492 Land Back Lane. There was a developer that wanted to rename this area, and the Six Nations demonstrators renamed it to 1492 Land Back Lane for very obvious reasons, I think. And I think you should check them out. And I think that you should donate to their legal fund, because Six Nations people are getting arrested. Journalists who go there to cover it are getting arrested. And it's just incredible that we live in this country where legal professionals and journalism professionals sit there while the OPP arrests people for documenting a land dispute. And people don't say anything. We need to put our bodies on the line, and we need to put our money into their coffers so that they can defend themselves from this kind of legal abuse, so that they don't just get picked off one by one until nobody is left. these injunctions, these legal injunctions that are being used are a tool of white supremacy to push Indigenous people off of their lands so the developers can have it. And if you're too afraid to break a legal injunction, like, well, what becomes of us, I guess? Like, and so we if we're going to do things like that, we have to do them in larger numbers so that people can have a sense of safety. Because I remember a demonstration, an anti-racism demonstration in Boston, I think it was a couple of years ago. And they were like, you know, like this ragtag group of 6 white supremacists who wanted to come out and say dumb shit with their signs, and like 50,000 Bostonians, and they weren't doing anything. They weren't doing anything because what were they going to do? So, you know, I think when we come out, we got to come out in the right numbers. And that requires a lot more organizing and planning and community building, because showing up in the street one day doesn't happen by magic.
And just to add to that, I think, again, just thinking about, again, what we mean by safety, right? So figuring out ways to make sure that Black folk are housed, Indigenous folks are housed, folks living on the margins are housed. Sorry, there's like a fly in my face. But finding those ways to help keep us safe, finding ways to make sure that people have safe transportation to and from events, all of those things contribute to our safety as well. And so just thinking through those things. And also, I think one of the things that I have an issue with sometimes in organizing is when sometimes like Antifa people get really riled up and just want to show up in places and actually put people at more risk because they're like, you know, kind of inciting violence and confrontation. And realistically, especially in the organizing that we do, we really try to make it kid friendly and family friendly. And sometimes when we have those folks, it can cause a lot of problems. So doing the opposite of that by like investing in de-escalation training, for example, like BLM, from our donations, BLM, YAG, we're doing a de-escalation training within our group and are hoping to continue that work to different community organizations and to small businesses, especially Black businesses in Edmonton. And so finding those ways to undermine what violence can look like, anticipating what violence can look like, anticipating what people need to be safe, I think goes a long way and makes a big difference.
I just want to add really quick to that too, that this summer, a really large and successful demonstration was organized after Regis Korchinski-Paquette died after a confrontation with the Toronto police. And like tens of thousands of people came out to that rally, which was organized by Not Another Black Life. And there were some criticisms of them for organizing a demonstration during COVID-19 and about the way that they did it. And, you know, Yusra Kogali, you know, a formidable organizer here in Toronto, had some like really, really useful and important commentaries about like being gentle with people who are trying to do this organizing work for the first time, and understanding that, as we were saying, people are going to make mistakes and that people are trying their best, that people are learning, and that if we see people in our communities organizing in ways that we don't think are safe, that the thing to do is not to take to social media and criticize them, but it's to reach out and say like, hey, can we talk about this? But there was another thing that happened, which was that a lot of people started organizing events and not saying who was behind those events or providing clear contact information. And I want to stress this because there was a misperception that some of us were saying, unless it's like a big time established group, whatever that means, that you should not go to their demonstration. I would never tell anybody that, and I don't believe in that. But when people are organizing in this climate and they don't give you contact information or say who they are, and they're just a shadowy organizing group, that doesn't feel safe for me in a climate where Black people are trying to get together to fight for ourselves and for other people. And so I really encourage people that if you're doing the organizing, please make someone visible so that people can know, hey, like this is who I reach out to if I have questions. This is who's responsible for this. This is how to contact them. This is maybe what they've done in the past. It doesn't mean that you have to be an established group, but it just means that like anonymous demonstrations for Black life are scary for me. And I understand when people do not trust them. So always make sure that if you're new to this kind of stuff, that you be open, so that when people want to communicate with the organizers of something, they know who to reach out to.
So thank you so much. With that, we get to our 2-hour mark. I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank the panelists for sharing their time, their energy to engage in this conversation. Just a reminder for everyone registered that we're giving away 3 copies of Desmond Cole's book, so make sure you are on the registration list. Yeah, it's a good book. I bought it twice, one for me, one for my aunt. It's good. You're not gonna get my copies, but you'll get your own. So definitely make sure you're registered. And with that, I want to just thank you, Reakash. Thank you, Desmond, for your time. I'll let you give your little close off if you want to say anything, but I get sure everyone's tired and has a lot to think about.
I'm good. Thanks. Be safe. Stay Black.
Have a good one, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, Sade. Thank you so much.
No problem.